out of time, so we can take some questions from you guys. But over the course of the next 45 or 50 minutes, I'm hoping that we can touch upon the history, the legacy, the present, and the future of railways in India. Talk through. I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. You've called out the construction of railroads in India by the British for being a colonial scam rather than active benevolence. You write about, you've spoken about as well, you've written and spoken about the motives behind the construction, the inefficient way in which they were built for private profit at public risk, the discriminatory hiring policies, and why, most importantly, why we must forgive but not forget.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I mean, the railways were a gigantic colonial scam, and the whole idea was to begin with, motivated by British self-interest, which is not surprising. That's why they were here, or there, rather. Lord Hardinge wrote a memo in 1843 where he said, essentially, this will be of great commercial advantage to us. The purpose of the railways was to go into the interior and extract resources, take them to the ports to ship them to Britain, as well as to send troops into the hinterland to quell any potential unrest. So the motives were very clear. It was about enhancing British power and British profit. They built it entirely at Indian expense. Indian taxpayers paid every penny of what it took to construct the Indian railways, but all the profits were made by British investors. In fact, it was the single most profitable investment you could make in the London Stock Exchange between about 1845 and 1875, because the government guaranteed double the rate of return of the highest return government security. Mind you, the percentages in those days were more modest, so the government securities gave 2.5% and the Indian Railways gave 5%, but that was still a lot of money. And people were always oversubscribing, so as a result, the government decided, let's overspend. They just spent as they liked in building the railways because they knew the money was going to be paid back by the Indian taxpayer. And the result was that for a long stretch of time, the 1850s particularly, 1 mile of Indian railway cost 9 times what the same 1 mile was costing at the same time in the US and Canada when railways were also being built there. So the scam continued. It continued in the sense, in fact, the expression private profit at public risk was a contemporary expression. Except the problem was the private profit was all British and the public risk was all Indian. On top of that, they built the railways, as I said, to serve their own purposes, and they ran it in a rather racist manner. They had this obsession that only white people could safeguard British interests in the railways, and so every significant position from station master and ticket collector to chairman of the railway board had to be occupied by a white man. This continued right up to the First World War when the world briefly started running out of white men. The racism was so explicit that every hire for the most menial tasks, stevedores or the tiniest sort of level crossing being manned by a chap in some obscure rural area, they would classify in 7 racial categories and decide which one somebody should be put into. I mean, I can go on and on, but I'll give you a couple more examples. One is that when they quickly abandoned the whites-only policy because it wouldn't have been viable. There weren't enough whites to fill the whites-only compartments. But the Indians traveled mainly in third-class compartments, which, with their primitive conditions, wooden benches, and lack of ventilation, attracted horrified comment even at that time. The purpose was never to facilitate travel. It was the rail lines were laid down for British purposes, and then since the lines could be used for people to travel, they tacked on these third-class carriages as well. One of my favorite cartoons, in fact, is one of one of these trains sort of by the mid-20th century with Indians pouring out of the third-class compartments, clinging to the windows, practically falling off on the side, sitting on the roof, and so on. And here are these 2 Brits in solar topis sitting in the first-class compartment saying, "My dear chap, there's absolutely nobody on this train," which was sort of the standard that was applied. What else, Pragya, did you ask about? Because there's so much to say, and I don't want to monopolize all the time.
No, you did.
But I think essentially one of the striking things was that, in fact, British companies were shipping freight on Indian railways at the cheapest rates of any freight on any railway in the world, while Indian passengers in those dreadful conditions were paying the highest passenger rates of any passengers in the world.
Yeah.
It really came with independence that the Indian government reversed those priorities, perhaps too far, because now freight on the railways has become unaffordably expensive, and as a result, more and more companies are shipping things on the very crowded highways and in diesel fumes spewing lorries. But at least the whole point is that the interests of the Indian consumer and the Indian traveler only really began to be taken into account after independence. So in any way, the bottom line is lots of countries have built railways without going to the trouble and expense of being colonized to do so. And therefore, your first point, Pragya, is no thanks to British colonialism for this.
I would agree. Christian, you Dr. Tharoor left off. You have also written about the rampant racism in this context, the appalling conditions under which poor Indians were forced to travel and how they ended up subsidizing the rich. But the racism wasn't just confined to the poor when it comes to Indians, was it? You write about a funny incident with Ashutosh Mukherjee. For those of you who might not be familiar, Ashutosh Mukherjee was an eminent jurist, lawyer, educator, mathematician, a leading public intellectual of his times.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about the racism as well, and perhaps also recount the incident for those of you who haven't?
Yes, I mean, the racism was rampant and throughout. And to pick up something that Shashi said, it was a great lost opportunity because there's all these skillful Indian people who might have been promoted into much better positions, helped to run the railway, helped to manage it, but they were prevented from doing so just by the racism. And the key example is the fireman's job, which in Britain, there was always a tradition that, you did the fireman's job for 10 or 15 years. It's a really heavy job, like putting coal into the boiler at kind of vast speed, right? And then you get a slightly cushier job when you reach your 40s or 50s of driving the train. And in India, the poor firemen had to do the job all their lives because they were not allowed to be promoted. Or if they were allowed to run goods trains or to maybe drive the trains in the sheds, kind of shunting around. And in every facet, I mean, it's almost embarrassing to be British. It's almost embarrassing to be English. And I'm not going to dispute anything that Shashi said. In fact, I mean, in some ways, his book is almost too kind to the British. You tried hard. But to give you a little example, I mean, it was funny that the British had a slight problem, right? That they couldn't quite say, whites only in first class, right? So there was some Indian relatively well-off people who used it occasionally. And on this occasion, this guy Mukherjee, he got into a compartment with just 2 beds first, and of course, as you do if you get into the compartment first, you go on the bottom bunk because it's the one that is. I actually like the top bunk, but most people go for the bottom bunk. So he puts his bottom bunk and goes to sleep, and he leaves his slippers on the floor. And then a white colonel or somebody, a relatively minor kind of military guy, gets on, doesn't like the fact that there's an Indian guy there, and has to share it with, and he's got the bottom bunk. So he sees these kind of slightly old slippers on the floor, and he throws them out the window. And then he goes to he's foolish enough to go to sleep, and he leaves his jacket kind of on the bottom. Big mistake, because then Mukherjee wakes up and sees that his shoes are missing, and then the white guy wakes up, and he said, "Where's my jacket? I can't find my jacket." He said, "Oh, your jacket's gone to look for my slippers." Which I hope is a true story rather than just apocryphal. Can I just take one point about modernization? Which is that, again, this was a fantastic missed opportunity because places like Japan, which also went to the railways quite late, but used their railways as a way of developing the economy. So they started off by not making their own locomotives, but they imported them and then kind of set up kind of protected locomotive companies to build the locomotives, right? And at first they were lousy, but then they developed the skills to do that, and then they built their own locomotives for the rest of history. And in India, they weren't allowed to do that. It was that they were banned from building their own locomotive. So there was no backward development of the economy from the railways. It should have been the catalyst for much faster development. So to say that if the British say, oh, it helped develop the economy, that is just quite the opposite.
Exactly. If I may just add to that, Christopher, because you actually made a very important point. 2 workshops were set off to repair and maintain the imported locomotives, one in Jamalpur, one in Ajmer. And the Indians became so good at it, they started making their own locomotives, which is why a law was passed banning them from doing so. Because, in fact, that would have prevented the profits going to the British companies. I think we imported something like 14,000 locomotives from Britain and about another 3,000 from Europe during the period from the ban in 1912 to independence in 1947. And of course, when independence came, there was no technology left. All these chaps who had been capable of designing and manufacturing locomotives had been fired and let off. And then we had to go cap in hand to the British to find out how to make locomotives ourselves. But history has this lovely way of being its own revenge, because today the people who run the British Railway, there's a company that used to be called, I think, Triton Palmer and Rendell. It's now called just Rendell. They get all their expertise from Wrights, which is a subsidiary of the Indian Railways that provides all the railway expertise to Britain today. So, turnabout is fair play. Your fireman story. There's a famous accident I recount in 1853 when the engine driver and the number 2 are both white people,
yeah.
And they both got drunk and fell asleep on the train. The poor fireman, the Indian, had no job, had no alternative but to continue shoving coal into the boiler, because that was his job, and he couldn't. So he did his job. The other guys went to sleep, and the train crashed. Whereupon the Commission of Inquiry found the fireman guilty for continuing to put coal into the thing, because it's his putting the coal that had driven the steam engine into the accident. Can you imagine? And these drunk fellows got completely scot-free because they were white. That was the kind of thing that happened all the time, I'm sorry to say, in the British Raj.
No, and there's absolutely, that's just one example where Indians weren't allowed to build their own locomotives. So there are any number of other examples where a lot of infant industries in India, a lot of innovation in India may have been stifled because of the way in which the British were able to exploit railways to promote their own trade. But there isn't enough time to get into all of that. However, as with most things, some good did come of it inadvertently. And one example is a fantastic econometrics paper that I recently read by an economist called Dave Donaldson, who's from the MIT. And he sort of uses a Ricardian model to show fairly robustly that when a district was penetrated by the railroad, interregional price gaps fell, trade flows went up, local volatility of prices went down, and most importantly, real agricultural income went up by almost 18% because farmers were able to exploit the competitive advantage. Of course, when you do a total cost benefit of how much good came of it, this might not add up to much. However, Christian, you do write about some of the inadvertent consequences of the railways in India, and one particular thing that you write about is how they ended up spurring nationalist sentiment and the call for freedom. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes. Can I just answer first the point about the economics kind of helping agriculture? Yes, to some extent, but it also facilitates grain being taken out of particular areas. So unless you have some control of that. Now, one of the most extraordinary examples, which is in my book, about how the Indians paid for their own oppression, as it were, was that there was this phenomenon called famine railways in the 1870s. And I thought, well, famine will solve, being a railway will actually solve a famine problem because they'll be able to bring grain in, although, of course, they could bring it out as well. And there's a big argument amongst nationalists who actually opposed it and said, look, if we build canals instead, we'd be able to irrigate, improve the productivity, and we won't need the railways. But nevertheless, they built some railways, and particularly this Bengal-Nagpur railway they built, which was actually built by the Rothschilds, who put some money into it. But the British government thought, this is a famine railway, it's going to help the local people. We can't let them get away with that. They have to pay for it in some way. So they imposed an extra tax on the local people to fund the profits of the Rothschilds, who are then getting only 3.5%, not 5%, but it's still a good rate of return. So in other words, the poorest people probably in the world, the Indian peasants, had to finance the profits of probably the richest people in the world, the Rothschilds. Absolutely extraordinary. So yes, I mean, nationalism was stimulated by the railways in two different ways, actually. One was the terrible treatment of people in third class, which, they weren't even allowed toilets for the first few years. There was a big debate whether they were allowed toilets. I mean, and sometimes they were locked in, and not allowed toilets. I mean, it just beggars belief how badly they were treated. And that goes on kind of really through into the mid 20th century, that it's still pretty bad, that was a source of great discontent. And there's the other aspect of this, which we talked a bit about earlier, but caused great resentment, was the fact that white people, and to some extent Eurasians, were given preferential treatment in terms of jobs, and so that stimulated, from the early 20th century, started stimulating a lot of political unrest, and the railways were seen, understandably, as a kind of object, a catalyst for oppression, and therefore were the target of quite a lot of strikes, occasional sabotage. And there was a third way in which actually they angered people, was that the construction of the railways was often on embankments, and that blocked off kind of natural flows of water. So if you're on the wrong side of the embankment and your source of water was blocked off, the railway would cause you great damage. And you get people going out at night and digging underneath the railways and being imprisoned as a result of that in the 1920s and so. So in lots of ways, the railways were such an obvious symbol of British colonialism that indeed they had to build railway stations for a long period. They built them as forts, kind of to protect in the event of any uprising.
So while things may not be quite as bad as they were during the colonial times, the poor in India don't fare very well on our trains today either. Monisha, I know that's not the focus of your book, and I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about what your book is really about in the following questions, but you do write about some of the conditions that prevail. Could you give us a sense of what kind of hardships passengers today have to go through on Indian trains, and what might be some of the conditions that you've seen?
Well, one of the, so my book is called Around India in 80 Trains, and I spent 5 months traveling the length and breadth and width of India by trains. Which mainly was, the reason I did it was because I hadn't been back to India for about 20 years since we moved from England back to India in 1991. Didn't really work out, so we came back. And I decided to go back and just sort of reassess my relationship with India, and I did it via the railways, mainly because it was so cheap. And my rail pass cost me £350 for 90 days, and that included all my sleeper trains, every meal, and my trip ended up being extremely cheap by the end of it. By any measure of traveling anywhere else in the world for 3 months would have cost me probably about 10 times that. But that goes back to what you were saying about how things are really cheap. And when I traveled, just one example, in Bombay, it's one of those images that's so iconic. Whenever you watch any BBC Railway series, you see all the trains at rush hour with everybody bulging out of the compartments. And as kind of cliched as that image is, it's not untrue. So I decided to see myself what it was actually like to travel at rush hour, and it was something that I was told immediately, do not do that, do not get on rush hour. It's the stupidest thing you could possibly do. You lose your shoes, you lose your mind. If you even come back, all right. But of course, I had to go and do it just to check. I think most Indians here will probably know of the term super dense crush load, which is a term absolutely assigned to that specific time of the day when commuters are on at rush hour. And you can have up to 7,000 people on one train, which is probably built for, I don't know, 1,000, maybe 1,500. And so I decided to do this, and I was horrified when I actually looked at the way middle-class Indians, low-class Indians, laborers, farmers, anybody you can possibly imagine, are literally forced to travel because they don't have any better means to do this. And I remember standing on the platform just looking up at some of the posters that they had, which tell you not to walk across the tracks. But so many of the provincial stations that I went to, there was no other way for you to get from one side to the other. The footbridge was broken, there'd been a fire and it hadn't been repaired. And people had to carry their things across. There was absolutely no way they could do anything else. And I wasn't at all surprised by the number of fatalities that there are every year from people being hit by trains, unmanned crossings. There's nobody there, so people are just strolling across, wheeling their bikes across. And this isn't something that should be happening it was 2010 when I went, but the fatalities every year are extraordinary. And a lot of people argue saying, but if you look at the fatalities of the railways compared with the number of trains traveling every year, it's not that much. But that's not really an argument that you should have when hundreds of people can die in one crash. And something that I discussed with the then railway minister, Dinesh Trivedi, he just said to me, if they don't do anything about the safety, the cars will become coffins. And when he explained to me how, because I couldn't quite understand why it was always the sort of third class and sleeper class carriages which ended up being the ones involved in the crashes. And he said, well, they're the oldest ones. And when you travel, say you're traveling from, say, Delhi to Ahmedabad, you can take a 5-hour service or a 6-hour service on a Shatabdi, which costs, I think, the equivalent of about £30. But most Indians can't afford that. So they'll take an overnight service, which costs probably about, I don't know, £2-3. But those trains are really old, and those carriages are really old. So when there are accidents, they're the ones that end up suffering the worst. And so I still feel like there's an element of racism, and people at the bottom end of the spectrum are still suffering on the railways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cost of being dependent on train travel in India is like I said, it may not be quite as bad as what it was during the colonial times, but it's still pretty appalling.
Can I just add something to what Monisha said? Because, as a British person, I'm very unused to walking on the tracks, right? We don't do that much. But we got to a station in Odisha called Lakshmipur Road. Quite a busy station, actually, because it was the place where the trains could swap round. The single track became a double track or triple track, actually. And we were waiting for our train, and another train, and there was just one platform. And we wondered, there's one platform, but there's 4 tracks. And we wondered, what's happening? The train came from the wrong direction. We thought, what do we do now? And we were explained that we had to actually walk through that train onto the tracks on the other side. To then climb up. There's a photograph in my book, which I hope you'll all buy afterwards, which shows me kind of standing on the track, waiting for this train, which kind of, even as somebody who knows a lot about railways, I tell you, standing next to a train on the tracks when it's kind of looming over you, it's very big and scary, and then we had to kind of climb up to take the train. And this was the only way of getting on our train. And, this is, 2016 at a busy station, which, somebody, maybe the local MP, maybe you should get on to the local MP, actually, could actually make a fuss about Lakshmipur Road and say, hey,
I'll convey to the local MP.
Not, if you find out who the MP is and hassle him,
Well, I'm glad you lived to tell the tale. Yeah. But Dr. Tharoor, you were talking earlier about how Indian engineers are now sort of helping the British run their railways, and Indian engineers can really help any railways run well. But despite the ubiquity of talent in India, why do you think our own railways, and this may not be a short answer, so it's a bit of a challenge, but I'm sure you're up to it. Why do you think our own railways could not be everything that they could and should be?
Well, I think principally it's democratic populism at work. We have starved the railways financially by ensuring that we maintain the cheapest passenger travel on earth. with the result that the railways simply do not make enough money to spend on necessary security improvements. It's a kind of vicious circle. And you know, every time that, Dinesh Trivedi, the minister you met, was fired.
I know, fired
because he tried to
actually
raise passenger
get into
rates.
Yep.
This is the short answer. There isn't enough money in the system.
Yeah.
The railways makes practically no operating profit, or a very negligible operating profit. They try and do it on the backs of freight goods. But the problem is that since you can ship freight actually more cheaply in lorries, despite the rising price of petrol, if you keep raising freight rates on the trains, companies will not use them. So it's become really a vicious cycle of bad policy choices, in a sense. Bad not from the interests of the traveling public, which, as long as they don't have an accident and they make it to the end of the journey, they're traveling very cheaply. But bad in the interests of the overall viability of the railways, security, maintenance, repairs, and all of that. One of the former railway minister who finally had to quit after a railway crash, one of the things that he tried to do is to actually modernize this aspect by creating first of all, his intention was to turn the railways into a corporation, but he also had given some thought to how he could actually bring on board a lot of investment into the railways. Not merely as an opposition MP, I was a bit skeptical as to whether anybody would be willing to offer that investment, because where would the profits come from if you're not willing to raise the rates and generate profits? But at least there was an attempt being made by Suresh Prabhu to try and have a holistic vision that would have made the railways more viable. But then there was one crash too many and he had to go. And where it's going to go next, we'll have to see.
We'll have to see. I'd like to actually bring Christian in on this a little bit later, but Monisha, you wanted to...
I just wanted to ask, do you use the railways?
Yes, once in a while, not terribly often. Because I'll tell you, I divide my time mainly between Delhi, where Parliament is, and my constituency of Thiruvananthapuram, which is as far as you can fly from Delhi without falling into the water. So if I took a train, it would take me 3 days each way. I only have a weekend to get back to my constituents before returning to Parliament. So, I therefore don't have many occasions to use the train. I do use the suburban railway in Trivandrum once in a while. And I'm proud to say I've done a lot of railway improvements, platform improvements, benches, signage.
Kerala does have the nicest railways.
Kerala, yes, but I mean, you do sometimes have to put your own MP funds in because the railways claim they don't have enough money. So, but I've been able to do that. I know that railways are a priority. And what's more, I've been able to extend certain rail lines and ensure certain trains stop at local stations where they didn't stop before, so that somebody who otherwise was spending 50 rupees to take a bus into Trivandrum town to do his job is now able to travel for 10 rupees on a train much faster. And therefore, of course, he votes for me, which is one of the good reasons for MPs to pay attention to railways.
That's excellent. Monisha, actually, I wanted to ask you earlier, your book is quite a bit different from the kind of books that Dr. Tharoor and Christian have written. And talking about it, the thing that I'm foremost curious about is, does, according to you, traveling by train really afford a window into the country that is hard to find elsewhere? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, when you think back about the universe that exists inside a typical Indian train, what do you think about now? And what do you think about when you think about the universe outside, as seen from a typical Indian train?
There's absolutely no doubt that Indian railways offer an unrivaled experience and a look into Indian society. Because, I mean, even the way the trains are set out, they are a microcosm of Indian society. You've got first-class carriage up at one end, and you've got the occasional politician and, upper-class Indians traveling in that side, and you've got, businessmen with their laptops out, and right down at the other end, you have farmers, and there's still the wooden slats. They still sit on wooden slats. They still have poor ventilation, and you have everybody in between. You've got students. You've got anyone you can imagine. And for me, it was the most fantastic way to travel, because over the Delhi to Trivandrum was 48 hours.
2 days. Well, I've not done it.
With delays.
It was actually one of my favorite journeys, because not only do you get to see India from top to bottom. You can sit in a doorway. Again, a safety issue, but for me, one that I let slide because it was the best way that I could actually see what was happening. And it's slow enough for you to be relatively safe. So I would sit in the doorway with a cup of tea from morning till evening, and you can see the way people's homes change. You can see the way the scenery changes. You can see the way food changes from one platform to the next as you travel through different states.
And the quality of the tea,
Quality of the
how much
tea,
milk.
different tea, different coffee, different books that you're offered by the vendors, the different outfits that people are wearing. You can hear different dialects as you're traveling through, and the kind of things that people chat to you about, the problems that they have from one city to the next, all the way down to the bottom in Trivandrum. And I would never, ever have found that kind of insight for 2 days on a bus or a plane where, you get on, everyone's very much focused on getting from A to B. Nobody really talks to anyone else unless there's a delay, and then you can sort of join together in your mutual hatred of your journey. But trains really do offer an insight. And also one colonial overhang that really did served me quite well was the fact that everybody spoke English. And I've just finished writing my second book, which is Around the World in 80 Trains. And the reason I did the world was because I couldn't find another country whereby I could travel by that many trains and be able to chat to people. I wanted to go to China, but there was no way I could do that because I couldn't communicate with people. So I had to do the world as a whole. And it was so striking by the end of the 8-month journey that I still felt like India offered me something that I couldn't really get from anywhere else. And as many conversations I could have from time to time with Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese or just anywhere we went, it was impossible to get that real relationship going that you can get when you're chatting with Indian people. And also the nature of Indian people want to talk to you. They always want to talk to you.
And offer you their food.
Offer food, offer advice, offer, anything you can come across, and the things that I came home with, the memories, the stories. I would reach into my backpack and I'd find, I actually had a copy of the Bhagavad Gita that a student had given me because we had a long, frustrated argument about religion, and he said, here, take my book. And I said, well, if you think, that I could learn something, why don't you impart it to me? And he said, okay, fine, you can have it. And I came home with, squashed marigolds from temples. I came home with bits of sweets that people had given me. I had everything you could possibly imagine. And I really didn't get that experience when I traveled in any other country by trains, and I still don't think I will, actually.
Can I just back that up briefly?
Sure.
I mean, it's an unparalleled experience traveling on Indian Rail. And again, I sat in the doorway as well. Sometimes they go a little bit fast and you get a little bit scared and you have to say, I can't sit in the doorway. But there is nothing better in the world than waking up on an Indian train at 7 o'clock in the morning, at dawn, and getting up and just going and sitting in the doorway and watching the farmers and the cows and the people kind of getting busy, and you see an insight into their lives. And just to back something else up, that the people are so, what is so humbling about India to somebody like me is that they're so bloody nice to us, and we didn't really deserve that. But yeah, they're so open to kind of what we're talking about, and so, in full of admiration for Britain. And it's a completely humbling experience and absolutely wonderful. And the sellers, the people who sell the food, I've traveled on, probably about 30 or 40 countries on the railway. Give me India anytime.
Sorry, we're not taking. These are all good things, of course. But Monisha, I was also wondering that in a country where travels on road can often, unfortunately, be less than safe for women, what was it like for you to travel alone by train for as long as you did?
I actually came away fine. I really did, and I think it's very difficult because recently, there's a lot of discussion about women being harassed, being raped, being gang raped, being groped, and these things do happen. They absolutely do, and we can't pretend that they don't. And invariably, the onus is always put upon women to cover up, stay off the streets after dark, don't do anything that you wouldn't normally do at home. And it's very difficult to feel, as a woman traveling, to feel like you have to take responsibility for your own safety, and yet at the same time you still do, because you know that if that is the way it is over there, then you have to take responsibility because no one else is going to look after you. So unfortunately, I did have to stay off the streets after 10 o'clock if I was alone. And I made sure that when I booked into specific compartments, the people who were booking the tickets for me at the time would tell me who else was going to be in those compartments. And they made sure not to put me with 3 men, even though I had perfectly safe, happy experiences traveling alone with men. But invariably, when I got on the trains and people started chatting and asking me what I was doing, families would always invite me to share their compartment, or they'd do a swap to make sure that somebody would always be there along the way till I got to my destination. And people they were very, very helpful. They would offer me phone numbers all the time. And even now, sometimes when my mum takes an old handset to India, even though it was 8 years ago, there's a Sikh gentleman from Chandigarh who still calls every so often to check, just to say hi and to check that I'm all right. And he was very sweet. He put me into a taxi that took me to the Wagah border and back. And that was something I was a bit nervous about doing alone. But he made sure that I was all right. And I wonder whether, to some degree, that was because they looked at me and they could clearly see that I was Indian as well. And I know that other women have had different experiences. But by and large, I was safe, and I felt quite happy traveling around there by myself.
Oddly, that's been my experience as well, but...
There are all women's compartments as well.
There are, but I also feel like they're sort of perpetuating the problem when you start segregating people more and more. Perpetrators don't get used to being around women and don't understand that you don't have to separate people for things to be all right.
Right.
Okay. So we have just about 5 minutes, I think. I'm going to ask very quick questions about the future a little bit, because that's what we've not really spoken about. And taking off from something Dr. Tharoor was saying earlier, Kristen, you have also written about how the companies that built the railways in India initially became subsidiary junkies. And you've made comparisons with public-private partnerships that are happening in the UK today. Now, like Dr. Tharoor mentioned, Indian Railways are hardly profitable right now. I think they've been incurring losses to the tune of about 35,000 crore per annum, or some bizarre figure such as that. Can you think of a couple of ideas going forward that might be helpful for, given the value of services and employment that Indian Railways offer, for them to run efficiently and perhaps also be economically viable?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to say, first of all, that on the whole, the railways are pretty efficient, actually. They, all the trains I took, I don't know if all the trains you took, but nearly all the trains I took were on time. They're scheduled in quite a lot of spare time in them, deliberately, to kind of make up. But on the whole, it is fairly efficient. Now, I'm not one to say they need to kind of vast amount of privatization, break it all up, kind of do what we've done here. I mean, those of you who are familiar with some of my writings will know that I'm not a great fan of privatization, and I don't see that as a panacea for Indian Railways. There is, though, as Shashi admitted personally, there is a problem that the politicians get far too involved in the day-to-day running of the railways. And there has been an attempt to kind of take that out of the field. I think they no longer have a Ministry of Railways. They have now a Ministry of Transport instead of just a Ministry of Railways.
No, they still have a railway.
They still have a railway.
What they have abolished is the railway budget, which was separate
They had a separate,
The railway ministry.
So somehow, you can never entirely take the politics out of railways, because, the railways are a fundamental part of the infrastructure of our country, or in India and a lot of other countries. But you do need somewhat more detachment of the day-to-day, involvement of politicians in the railway. So, for example, there are services from various parts of India to Delhi or to Mumbai or to the main towns that are not really economic, but because some politician has managed to get those services kind of put on, those services stay on forever, even though it's really not worthwhile. So all I would say is that you need some tinkering. You need some ways of making it a bit more efficient. You could do with sometimes a bit better service culture. I mean, there are people who have learned bureaucracy at the hands of the British, and boy, have they learned it. Trying to get my tickets out of the lady at Calcutta station who refused to accept that my PNR number was a PNR number. And it wasn't until I stood there for 10 minutes saying, this is my number, put it in the computer. It's not a PNR number. I said, it is. You know, so you could do, and eventually I got my ticket. I mean, you could do with some improvements. They could definitely, you know, have slightly fewer staff in some circumstances. But that's not, you know, it's quite important that you have a lot of staff. It's quite important that it employs a lot of people. It's a way of kind of generating kind of income for an awful lot of people. So I would tinker about the edges, not suggest some great big break it up, privatize it, you know, cut all the uneconomic trains, because you'll just get into Beeching territory. You know, and Beeching was wrong, right? Beeching didn't understand that the railway is a network, and if you start cutting off the branches, the tree will die. And so, you know, no radical things, but tinkering and less involvement of politicians.
Excellent. I think we're almost out of time, but any quick comments,
We got 5
Monisha, on the same question, actually, improvement wish list?
No, I don't know where to start with the improvements. It's just incredibly frustrating seeing, you know, the state of the railway still in 2018, especially after I then travelled around the world and still came back to thinking that Indian railways are pretty bad. And, you know, even in Thailand, they're not as bad. In Vietnam, they're not as bad. And I mean, if there was any real answer to that, I think it would have been found yet as to what you can do. But again, I think it is very much a case of bureaucracy. And I mean, like you said, people like Dinesh Trivedi, who was railway minister at the time when I was there, he was trying very hard to try and change things, but the powers above don't seem to want you to do that for various reasons.
I mean, it boils down to resources, and I think the key issue is how do we get resources into the railways to make all the improvements you want. I mean, for example, we do need more automatic signalling systems. Yep. It will both reduce accidents and speed up the frequency between trains if you actually worked automatically. Right now, everything's manual, you see. Yeah. And so if one train, for whatever reason, is stuck somewhere, there's a whole lot of consequences that then have to be caught up with manually, which is very difficult. The second thing is undoubtedly, I mean, I have to disagree respectfully with Christian on the interference of politicians. Because politicians have to represent their constituents' interests. And sometimes bureaucrats, because they have no accountability to the voters, don't particularly realize that some trains are needed in some places because people need to get around. But having said that, they certainly shouldn't have the last word, and every decision made should be reviewed, say, every 3 years on grounds of viability, so you don't have trains to nowhere, as you were pointing out, and I have no problem with that. But ultimately, it all comes down to resources. You have the resources, you can improve the trains, the coaches, you can create better conditions for travelers at all levels. Bathrooms are...
But you're politicians, you've got to drive more resources.
I'm an opposition
politician. I know you're an opposition.
I do my very best from
Congress has been ruling quite a lot of the history of India. I mean, why didn't they get the resources then?
No, as I said, because they tried to keep it cheap. It's a policy choice. The policy choice was made to keep it cheap. And particularly because under the Brits it was so expensive. Essentially, the idea was let the Indian traveller travel cheaply, even if it meant starving the railways of the money it needed. That was the real policy choice.
Yeah, and there are always opportunity costs of decisions, but this has been a very serious, even a very interesting discussion. But since this is still a literature festival, I'm going to end the session by asking all of you to recommend maybe your favorite, some of your favorite train books. They don't have to be travelogues, they don't have to be history books. You can name Murder on the Orient Express, if you will. Anything that you've read and would like to recommend for us to read. Starting with you.
I thought The Great Railway Bazaar by Paul Tharoor was rather good. Yeah. It's about now 40 years old, but it does have a nice section on India, as well as traveling some of the trains that no doubt Monisha took now for her new book.
Yeah. Well, you I believe, were inspired by Phileas Fogg's journey around the world in 80 days. So
for the same reason. Yeah, very obscure book, actually, called Strangers on a Train by Jenny Diskey, who travelled around the US. I particularly enjoyed that. And while I do enjoy some of Paul Tharoor's writing, I think there are others that I would prefer to read.
There's an obscure book by a guy called Gerard Fiennes, who is a relation of the Fiennes actor, actually, and the Fiennes explorer, who wrote a book called I Tried to Run a Railway. and it's all about dealing with the bureaucracy. It's been reprinted recently, actually, it's not from the 1970s, but dealing with the bureaucracy, how to improve a railway, how to make branch lines actually economic, and all that sort of thing. Absolutely brilliant book, and it should be read by all railway managers.
And on the Anglo-Indian community and their association with railways, there's a now forgotten bestseller by John Masters called Bhavani Junction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which actually was made into a rather interesting black and white film with Ava Gardner, I think it was, who really was Anglo-Indian, was hiding it,
Yeah.
but played the part of an Anglo. Very interesting.
Very, very interesting. I really wish there was a book on the food, the railway food that used to exist, the railway mutton cutlets and so on, a recipe book of that. But
there's a book just coming out. I've just written an endorsement for a book that is coming out later this year on precisely that. I don't know what it's called, but it has all the food.
I might. That's the best piece of news of her today. Excellent.
So you'll buy it.
All right. With that, I'm quite done. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience.
Oh my God.
Ms. Misani, please. Thank you.
I'm going to go against the grain here because I don't think we have a very balanced panel. I think there are several reasons for the British to be very proud of the railways they built in India, far more than of British Rail here. Anyone who looks at the private papers of Lord Dalhousie, who founded the Indian Railways, could see that there were more than one motive. It's so simplistic to say it was purely to move troops around. There was famine relief, there was integrating the Indian economy, there was making India a more integrated administrative and political unit. All of these things did happen due to the railways. You mentioned, Pragya, the increase in standards of living, in agricultural incomes by almost 18%. Several studies confirm that. Secondly, Shashi's point, which is a very tired old point about the cost of the railways. As he would know if he had been a railway minister, it is very expensive to get capital for infrastructure projects in developing countries. They all have to pay very high rates of interest or return. The government of India under the Raj paid 5%, which was 0.25% more than the global borrowing rate. The interest rate was 4.75%. And 7% was being paid at the same time. There were counterfactuals in Brazil and Argentina, which were independent countries constructing their railways at the same time, paying guarantees of 7%. The cost per mile in Argentina and Brazil was double what it was in India. You can't compare with Canada and the USA. The terrain in India is completely different. And the results of it were the enormous sort of basis for India's industrial revolution, which began in the 1850s. India, by 1900, had the world's third largest railway system. It had created it faster than any developing country other than Japan and Russia, who were still ahead, any non-European country. And it was nationalized by the government of India by 1924.
There's a lot of people want to come in. What's your question?
I'm trying to address some balance to this very unbalanced panel, which hasn't looked at a lot of facts. By 1924, all the private companies had been nationalized, and therefore India had a very efficient railway system which enabled its industrial revolution to take off.
Thank you. Thank you for that point of view.
No, I do think we should set the record straight in some of the stuff. I mean, Dalhousie's very self-serving memoranda, which in fact spoke of what Zarir politely calls administrative integration in India, which meant putting more British control over the Indians, is precisely the point I was making. I didn't say it was only about moving troops around. I did say it was about extracting resources from the interior and taking them to the ports, which is precisely the way the rail lines were built. Famine relief was a completely fraudulent claim. They did claim it, and as Christian demonstrates in his book, and as I more briefly demonstrate in mine, there are actual studies that demonstrate that where the railway lines went, the famines were at their worst. Because they did not. There are studies. I'm sorry, Zari. Your revisionism is what's getting a bit tiresome now. I mean, honestly, everything the British did is wonderful for you. I'm sorry, the evidence is not in your favor.
Just one,
All right,
one point.
I'm going to have to, in the interest of the larger audience here, so we can take a little bit more questions.
Okay.
This is a fascinating debate, and I hope that JLF will host it at another point in time. But for now, May I please request that just ask questions and we don't have time for comments. The authors are around, so you can talk to them later. But if you have any questions, please. Sure. Up to you.
Mic is still not working.
Okay. Sorry, my point is the railway should not be treated like a business venture or any principal activity. It is an activity, but should be treated like a utility. And I feel Indian government does not collect enough taxes. As far as I know, 2 to 3% of the Indians pay taxes. So I think that network should be increased and use the money.
Sorry, is there a question?
Yeah,
in
I mean,
there?
yeah, I
Sure.
think should that not point be? Okay.
It's not actually good.
Okay, sure. The lady over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a question.
Thank you very much.
I just want to know what the panel's views are on the planned bullet train from Mumbai to Ahmedabad. To me, it seems like an utterly bizarre use of investment and resource, given what you've all said. And I'm just interested what you think about that direction of travel.
That's a very good question too.
Do you mind if I go with this? I actually wrote a piece of Telegraph about this when it happened, and got hugely attacked in the comment section by Indians mainly. But I pointed out the fact that the money can't be assigned anywhere else because Japan has specifically given them the money for this particular line. So you can't.
We don't have to accept it, though.
This is true. This is very true. But again, it's putting in a line that is already really well served. It's a line that has, I think, about 14 trains that already do that daily.
Exactly.
The cost of the ticket is something above £40, I think, is the cheapest ticket, which your average Indian is not going to be able to pay. And it's not serving the people who actually need the trains. It's not a line that needs to be improved. It's not a line that needs a bullet train. It just feels like a bit of a vanity project, and it seems to be serving the people who are MPs around that area.
I agree entirely. I mean, I think it's an appalling idea. Bizarre is your word, but it's a vanity project, and the justification being given is it makes the Japanese happy. Well, let's find some other ways of making the Japanese happy than by incurring a huge debt for something that nobody needs, and that will in fact never be viable because the first-class tickets will cost 3 times a plane ticket, and you'll get you'll get to Bombay by plane in about the same time. So why bother?
Yeah, absolutely.
Shashi's absolutely right. I mean, this is just like HS2 here, which I've completely, which I've, despite loving railways, I've opposed all the way through, and it's exactly the same sort of thing. What the money should be sent, as Shashi pointed out, spend the money on improving the existing railways, on the signalling, on whatever, not building some new line that is not enormously necessary and will be fantastically expensive.
And there are fascinating, excellent, very robust studies on the projected cost benefit of the HS2, which I think will also be externally valid to India, which show that it makes no sense whatsoever under any circumstances. But one last question, maybe, ma'am.
It'll take me 10 minutes to stand up now. But I want to ask you a simple question. We are all talking about pushing resources in the railways. Looking at the state of corruption in India, all the money which has been given to the railways, in your view, do you think all has been used correctly and justly by the railways?
Sorry.
I honestly wouldn't feel comfortable to answer that. I really don't know.
I mean, I don't know either, but there is corruption, certainly, in every government department. It'd be odd to assume the railways were exempt. But by and large, I mean, there are new trains, there are new coaches, there are staff are getting their salaries. I mean, it's not as if all the money disappears into a sinkhole. It's just the needs are vast. The Indian railways are the single biggest employer in the world of any institution. They are the biggest. At one point, the railway budget was larger than the country's budget, which is why it was presented separately, a habit that we've finally grown out of. But the vastness of the enterprise means there's a lot of money being spent in all sorts of ways and directions, some of which may well perhaps be siphoned off corruptly. But I don't really think that's the biggest problem. I think even objectively, the railways generates much less revenue than it could.
Are we done? Do we have time for one more question? All right. In the back there, please. Thank you.
Railway here.
the thing is that I was just always wondering, there's always like a class system in a railway for rich, poor, and also middle class people. AC compartment, local compartment, and really low compartment at the back side of the train, at the front side of the train. My question is here, why the Indian government is selling more tickets to the low compartment, and the people can't fit there. They're just traveling in a toilet. It's really hot and humid, and everything is broken. So the question is here, why are they selling more tickets? I don't understand. If the people, if the passenger is like, suppose there's 100 people they can fit there, they're selling 200 tickets. Only for poor, not for rich, and not for like middle class coaches. Just all for poor. Why like this? I never understood this system.
I didn't know they were doing that. If they are, it's wrong. It should be stopped.
Overselling, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that shouldn't be happening, but I'm afraid I've never been in the railway ministry and I've never had anything to do with these things. I don't know.
Also, I mean,
Either
one
of you
isn't
know if it's
exactly,
right.
I'm not sure whether people are just traveling without ticket as well, because
There's a lot of
happening
tickets.
Yeah,
as
there's a
well.
lot of that.
So one can't really say whether they're being sold, more tickets are being sold. That does sound a bit bizarre to me, but also the needs. I mean, they're just...
No, I mean, I
That
think
many people need to travel.
I think, you know, I did travel in the sometimes in the second class, and yeah, it was very crowded. But I think the thing is that they're not selling for particular trains. It's unreserved, a lot of it. So, you know, the demand is so great. I mean, the train's already 20 carriages long. You know, fitting more on is impossible. And there is enormous demand. So you get an awful choice there, whether you say to people, sorry, you can't travel, even though it's very necessary, and there aren't very many other ways of getting around. The aeroplanes are still relatively expensive, and anyway, don't serve a lot of kind of provincial cities. Or so you either tell people you can't travel, or they travel in uncomfortable conditions. But, you know, I think, you know, you've got to get the balance right. I think it's probably right to accept a lot of people onto them, even if it's crammed. It's providing a service. As that gentleman says, you know, the railways are, and in India this is true, possibly in a lot of places, it is an element of social service. It is a utility. You know, it is the main way of getting around. But of course you could price a few off. But that's a contentious decision.
But I think you're right that it's because of unreserved travel. It's the reserved seats they can't sell more. In fact, they number and name the seats they sell. So that couldn't be.
So, sorry, I have to cut you now because we're out of time and there are more sessions to come, but the panelists are around in case you want to chat with them later.